Hi everyone, I'm Caroline Mandler, the Executive Director of Wilton Library. So on behalf of everyone here at the library, I would like to welcome you all here to the Brubeck Room tonight. It's really an honor to work with Wilton Youth Council throughout the year and to be able to host events like these together for the community. They're always so informative, and we were especially thankful that this program came together and that we have the opportunity to discuss such an important topic tonight. So thank you for joining us. I will now hand it over to Carrie Ann Finelli from Wilton Youth Council.
Thank you, Caroline. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight. I know it's really hard to go out on a January night, so we appreciate it. I'm Carrie Ann Finelli, and I co-chair Parent Education with Heather DiBenedetto Reading, who's standing at the back, for the Wilton Youth Council. We're thrilled to be meeting here in the library in this beautiful space. Thank you to the Wilton Library for co-sponsoring this event, and to Michael Bellicosa, Head of Adult Programming, Andrea Sato, Programs Assistant, and Thomas Kozak, Head of Technology, for all of their help in preparing for today. We would also like to thank Mountainside Treatment Center, the Wilton Public Schools, Wilton Police Department, Middlebrook PTA, Wilton High School PTSA, and SPED for their sponsorship of today's presentation. And many thanks to Chandra Ring, Wilton Youth Council Executive Director, for all of her support with parent education programming. Just a quick note that Middlebrook Principal Jory Higgins is not able to be with us tonight, so we thank Middlebrook Dean of Students, Nicole Kerze, for her willingness to join us on the panel tonight. Please be on the lookout for Wilton Youth Council's upcoming February 7th and 9th parent education webinars, Raising Kids in a Digital World, with Diana Graber, author and recognized expert on technology's impact on human behavior. She was here last year on a webinar and she was fantastic, so I really hope you'll join us. There'll be two webinars, one for pre-K through 5th grade parents and one for 6th through 12th grade parents. Please see the flyers at the back, and you can also go to our website, wiltonyouth.org, to get more information. If you're really interested in this topic, we have a few of Diana's books on the back table, and you're welcome to take one on the way out. And then you have to come to the webinars. No, I'm kidding. A few upcoming events we're co-sponsoring with our community partners. Just so that you know, you can view some flyers at the back, and the information will again be on our website. One is called Helping Families Navigate Mental Health and Suicide Conversations with Kids. That will be February 6th via Zoom, 12 to 1 p.m. Then we have Let Them Thrive, a two-part event. The first part is an in-person book discussion of the book, Let Them Thrive, which will be on February 28th. And then there's going to be a virtual workshop on March 9th. This event provides practical strategies for helping your child become a self-navigating expert learner, which is a key aspect of the Wilton Public Schools portrait of the graduate. And then we will have a community conversation on mental health, and it's going to be a discussion led by Dr. Gerber from Silver Hill Hospital, and that will be on March 3rd. So we have lots of really interesting programming coming up, and we really hope you'll join us and spread the word. Again, all the information on wiltonyouth.org. Please go to the website, sign up for our monthly newsletters if you have not done so already. Take a look at some of our past recorded events. There's a lot to dig into there. Tonight's slide presentation will be shared on our website, so there's no need to take notes unless you'd like to. There are index cards and pencils on your seats if you'd like to jot down any questions. And we're going to welcome questions during the Q&A. And we'll have roaming mics, but if you prefer to have your question on a card, we'll also collect those and we can ask them for you if you prefer it that way. Please be aware that tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted on our website. As such, you may want to avoid disclosing any sensitive information during the Q&A. As always, we'd like to remind you that Wilton Youth Council programs are for informational purposes only and do not constitute medical advice and are not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Before you leave, please complete the brief evaluation that you found on your seat. Please, please, please. And we'll collect them in the back, or you can leave them on the table in the back as you leave. It really helps us figure out what you guys are interested in, what your preferences are, what you thought of our programming. Many thanks. So now I'd like to introduce our two presenters, Melissa and John, and then I will introduce the rest of the panelists after the slide presentation. Since 2010, Melissa McGarry has served as project director of Trumbull's Prevention Partnership, a local prevention coalition who strives to prevent underage drinking and drug use and promotes social and emotional wellness through education, outreach, enforcement, and public policy. Previously, Melissa worked as a public health consultant, performing program evaluation, strategic planning, needs assessment, and grant writing services for local nonprofits, municipalities, and state agencies. Melissa holds a BA from the University of Notre Dame. John Davio is a community psychologist and certified dialogue education practitioner with over 30 years of leadership, training, facilitation, and consulting experience in nonprofit organizations and schools. John has focused his work on coalition and organizational development, substance abuse and violence prevention, school safety initiatives, and prevention workforce development. A natural collaborator and networker, John has significant experience in supporting communities, organizations, and schools with systems change issues, utilizing strategic prevention framework as a community-wide prevention model, implementing best practices and evidence-based programs, organizational development, and problem-solving issues, including barriers to effective prevention practice. John's a passionate leader in the field of prevention and has held leadership position in Connecticut Association of Prevention Professionals, Connecticut chapter of Smart Approaches to Marijuana, and the Connecticut Coalition to Stop Underage Drinking. Whoa! Welcome, Melissa and John.
Good evening. Oh, there we are. Somebody's gonna make this work. It's kind of a full circle moment for me. I was saying that the last time I was in this room was probably 7 or 8 years ago when I came to listen to a speaker that Wilton brought in, all talking about the new marijuana. And I remember sitting there and like scribbling madly. And here we are years later. It's been commercialized in Connecticut, and lots of people want to know what we're dealing with. So John and I are here to just give you some information tonight about, okay, let's see how we move. There we go. Just to provide you with some information about and research on the risks of underage cannabis use, and also describe what is actually permitted in Connecticut's law. You'll notice our language. We're pretty careful. You won't hear us use the term recreational marijuana, which we know is really common in part of the vernacular, because it's normative to our kids. And so you'll hear John and I use the term non-medical, adult use, or retail marijuana. So and cannabis, we'll use those terms kind of interchangeably. So let's get ourselves all on the same page. We all know the cannabis plant, but did you know it's made up of thousands of chemical compounds called cannabinoids? So 2 of them have become household names. We hear a lot about THC, which is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the psychoactive component. That's the chemical that creates the high. We also hear a lot about cannabidiol, which is CBD. That does not produce any high, but it's attributed with a lot of the medicinal or calming effects. Anyone see the article today that the FDA has just decided that CBD does not qualify to be approved as safe for human consumption in food or supplements? So that's brand spanking new, right hot off the presses. So not in our presentation, and we're not going to talk too much about CBD, but interesting. The other thing we're seeing is a whole new raft of products. They're synthetic THCs, things like delta-8 and delta-10 and others that we'll talk about a little bit in a little bit. So let's show you, oops, can't use this. So let's show you, a lot of us who grew up, in the past, in the 60s or 70s or 80s, we think of pot, right? We think of pot, we think of plant matter. And we're talking about a lot more products than this. And the other thing to remember is the marijuana, we call it like the Woodstock weed. The Woodstock weed was about 0.5% THC. And then we saw kind of in the 60s to 80s, it increased to about 1 to 4% THC. The plant matter THC that's out there now has been grown to have potency up to 40% THC. And those growers will still look to maximize the THC power in this plant. So the plant itself bears very little resemblance to the plant that many people grew up with. So that's really important to know. The other thing is we have this raft of other products, and we want to show you some samples just so we get ourselves all on the same page. We have things like vape oils. So when we look at a THC vape oil, that means that there's an oil that's infused with THC and other chemicals and flavorings. It's consumed either using a pre-filled vape or an inhaler, or a pre-filled vape cartridge that is used in a reusable vape. They're called dabs. They're discreet. Users report that the high is much more powerful, and they are, it's supposed to be easier on the lungs than smoking the plant matter. They have the same health risks as vaping nicotine. We have things like concentrates, and these come in lots of formats. So you'll see things, and the names often resemble the form they're in. So we hear dabs, wax, shatter, butter, amber, honeycomb, based on what that format looks like. And I like to show this because this isn't botany anymore. You need a very complicated extraction process to concentrate the THC into high potency dosage. We're talking like 95% THC and up. So really, really, really powerful, potent. You know, this isn't a mild drug at this point. We're talking, you know, it's been compared to kind of the crack cocaine of cannabis. And they're consumed using these complicated dab rigs, which are special bongs or even dab pens, so even like a vape. The effects are felt almost immediately, and in other states where these were marketed, you do see some warnings that these products are really not intended for first-time users because they're really intended for people who have built up a tolerance. So you can't get the effects from your lower potency weed, you move to this. And John's going to talk a little bit about the risks of these for our young people. Then we have edibles. And you know, we can go by what's been marketed in other states. In Connecticut, and we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the steps Connecticut has taken to try to mitigate the risks of these products. But I mean, all of these are THC products that have been sold in other states. And they're very difficult to tell the difference from their non-marijuana brethren. Other states, we've seen things like lookalikes, Klondike bars instead of Klondike bars, Pop-Tarts instead of Pop-Tarts. Really similar, very intentional. Now the challenge with edibles, what's a serving size? Some states, a serving size might be 1/6 of a cookie. Anyone ever eaten 1/6 of a cookie? Not me. Wide range of potencies. How do you know how potent that cookie is? It can take up to 2 hours to feel the effects of an edible because the food has to get into your stomach and then go into your bloodstream. So guess what happens? People take an edible, nothing happens. And then they think, oh, I paid a lot for this. Nothing's happened. Let me take some more. So it's really easy to overconsume, really easy to get sick. The effects can last for quite some time. And it's easy to accidentally consume a marijuana edible, either by, you know, an adult or kids or pets. So really concerned about some of the things there. We've seen them marketed. We update this slide for every holiday. These are the Valentine options. You know, we see a lot of products that are catered to consumption at holidays, and I don't know whose child could differentiate between those candy hearts and others. So, you know, we have some concern that these products really do appeal to kids. Tinctures, been asked a lot about tinctures lately. A tincture is made from, it's almost like a tea bag, really. You take plant matter, you soak it in food grade liquid, usually an oil or food grade alcohol or food grade glycerin, and then it's strained. It's ingested orally under the tongue, so just a few, you know, some people can just choose a few drops. It can be done or put in food. Sublingually, it's a much more immediate high than a typical edible because you're putting it under your tongue, and the high can be quite long-lasting depending on the potency. It's very discreet. The proponents will say, well, you can really control the dosage. So that's what people who encourage tincture use, and we're seeing a little more tinctures. I mentioned earlier the synthetic THCs. We've seen in the area Delta 8, Delta 10, Delta 11, Delta HHC, and now Delta O acetate, which is a new product. These products can be derived from hemp, they can be derived from CBD, or they can be derived from cannabis, because it's chemistry. As a result, there are businesses, farmers markets, fairs selling these other THC products that don't necessarily have a cannabis license in Connecticut. So we are seeing them in gas stations. We're seeing them in other places in neighboring towns. I don't know about Wilton, but these products do create a high. It may be less than a Delta 9, but there's no real quality control. So it's difficult to say with any certainty what you're getting. The other challenge is this new product, THCO acetate. That has many of the same structure. It has very similar structure to the vitamin E acetate that was in vapes a couple of years ago that was causing all the E-Valley. So if anyone's vaping THCO acetate, there's some real concern that those same health risks are possible. So, you know, what we want to highlight, all these slides, right, is this just enormous range of products and how challenging it is to regulate this. Also, how challenging it is to talk to our kids about it, right? Because they're just coming in so many different formats. I mean, this isn't Connecticut, this is a store window in another state, but just the range of products that are all intoxicating, many of which are hard to recognize, is something that we want parents to be aware of and families to be aware of. Now, John's gonna come up here and talk a little bit about potency and also talk about the risks, and then I'm gonna circle back and talk about the law. So I'm gonna hand you over to John.
One of the things that, kind of building on what Melissa was just saying about potency, right? Potency back 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, down in that 1% to 4% to maybe even 6 or 7% in the 90s. But now, when we look at products and we look at the researchers who are studying the effects of THC on the developing adolescent brain, physiology of kids, right? What they found is that they consider anything over 10% THC to be high potency. And this researcher at the bottom, and I should mention this, that you'll start to see these citations at the bottom of the slide. And again, you'll have access to this presentation, so you don't need to take notes unless you want to. But this researcher, Jason Kilmer from the University of Washington, he's great. But you can see that in these 4 markets, between 94 and 97% of the products are all over 10% THC. So they're all high potency products, all products that we really need to be concerned about if our kids are using them. This, I'm sure, will be similar to what we see here in Connecticut. So how is marijuana harmful? So it is addictive, and I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, right? Research has been very clear on this. I don't usually include citations from 1994, but I did on this slide because we've known this since 1994. Just as a reminder, this isn't something new, right? And more addictive for kids than for adults. Because of the developing adolescent brain. If you do the math using our demographic data for the state and the Connecticut Youth Risk Behavior Survey, there's about 11,000 high school students in Connecticut who are addicted to marijuana right now. I'll have the opportunity and the privilege of meeting with a former youth addicted to marijuana next week, as a matter of fact, so I'm looking forward to that. Marijuana and pregnancy. This is really important stuff as well. THC does cross the placenta, and as you can see, right, it causes brain damage in fetuses, but not only brain damage, it affects their movement abilities. And once they are born and they are young, right, the THC exposure in utero compromises their IQ, and we'll see that coming up in a few more slides for adolescents. But this is really important because in Colorado for a while they were marketing marijuana products as a morning sickness cure, right? And this is really bad. This is going too far. Okay, marijuana and mental health, right? We've heard a lot about this already, but again, significantly linked with a number of mental illnesses, including things as serious as schizophrenia. People who use marijuana more likely to develop a psychosis, right? Not knowing what's real, having hallucinations or being paranoid, right? The association between marijuana and schizophrenia is stronger in people who start using marijuana at an earlier age. We're seeing a lot of much earlier onset of schizophrenia than we were seeing previously due to marijuana use. And that doesn't mean that they might not have developed it later, but they're developing it earlier. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you know, you'll see these pictures, you know, so here's malt balls. Here's malt balls, right? Marijuana malt balls, right? Use of any other drug amongst youth is going down except for marijuana. Hey, get this, the CDC tells us lifetime use of marijuana is the #1 risk factor for opioid misuse. Isn't that incredible? The #1 risk factor for opioid misuse. 22% of high schools nationally, right, report using marijuana. And in Colorado, for those Colorado high school students using marijuana, more than half of them said they dab marijuana. Now this again is, you know, this high potency marijuana, which again, at least 50%, but up to 95, even 99% THC. This is not, you know, again, this is not weed of the 60s or 70s, 80s or 90s. It's, you know, and it's chemical, it's chemistries at this point in time. This is not, you know. And of course, the Surgeon General did release a report and weighed in on this a couple of years ago as well. That is a vape pen. I don't know what it looks like to you. I'm not sure what it looks like to me, but it definitely does not look like a vape pen. And what I'm seeing, I see a lot of different youth surveys around the state. And what I'm seeing is that vaping seems to be the method of ingestion for THC that the kids are choosing. That's what they're using more than anything. Not smoking it, they're eating it some, but vaping is their preferred method. And again, it's very discreet, right? That thing is pretty discreet, right? That's in my pocket. How do you know that I have it? And, but by the way, oh, there we go. You know, I mean, it's very discreet. And for many of them, not all of them, but for many of them, very low or no odor, right? So teen vaping has doubled between 2013 and 2020. And again, adolescents who report vaping cannabis within the last 30 days increased 7-fold, right? 1.6 to 8.4%, 2013. These are national survey data. So again, the vaping is increasing, and so what we see when we see that, you know, and I won't get into the law. Oops, I almost went there. I'll restrain myself. Okay, so THC effects on the brain, right? And again, this is the adolescent brain. I should have put the word adolescent brain in there, right? It mostly, I mean, actually, there's a whole lot of other effects, and I could spend 2 hours talking about all the effects on the brain, but if we just talk about the hippocampus, right? That part of our brain center for attention, concentration, and memory. If you look at these 3 research studies, one from 1996, 2001, 2010, they get consecutively more sophisticated. We end with this 2010 study, which says, well, deficits in verbal learning takes 2 weeks, right? Before no difference with the comparison group. Verbal working memory, right? That's that, you know, you're being responsible for temporarily storing verbalizable information, such as letters, words, or numbers, right? That verbal memory working memory, 3 weeks before there's no difference with the comparison group. and deficits in attention still present at 3 weeks, right? So this is what we're seeing with adolescents and using marijuana, and the high potency marijuana especially. We had that Duke University study from over 10 years ago now that demonstrated a permanent IQ drop of average of 6 to 8 points amongst teens who used marijuana 3 to 5 times a week. Now, this is a study that has been going on for a long time. It started in the 80s and 90s. This marijuana that these kids were using was 1980s and 90s potency marijuana. Let's talk about that first. So we're talking maybe 4 to 6, 7, maybe 8% THC in the end of the 80s and into the 90s, right? So that's the first thing. Permanent. Let's talk about that word permanent for a minute. So some of those kids, who lost that IQ, right, when they were checked at the end of their teens, at the end of their high school years, maybe some of them stopped in their 20s, right? When they were tested again about 40 years of age, none of them had regained that those IQ points, whether they had stopped in their 20s or not, or continued to use marijuana. They had lost that IQ permanently. Now, maybe as the study goes on, maybe in their 60s, maybe it'll come back. I can't say, but at this point in time, it certainly looks permanent. Individuals under the age of 17 who use marijuana daily, right, cannabis daily, 60% less likely to complete high school or obtain a degree. And again, that's from the Lancet Psychiatry, very, very respected British journal. Longitudinal study of middle school students. So they started looking at them in middle school, followed them through high school, and while greater alcohol use predicted academic unpreparedness and delinquency, marijuana predicted those two things, but then in addition, the poor academic performance and mental health conditions. One of the things that we keep hearing is that, well, at least they're not using alcohol. They're using pot, but they're not using alcohol. At least they're not using alcohol. Oh my God, and I don't want to minimize the dangers of alcohol on the developing adolescent brain. That's not what I want to do at all. But marijuana is actually more dangerous than alcohol on the developing adolescent brain. These are messages that we really need to get through. The mental health issues and the academic performance issues are two examples of that. Cannabis use and impaired driving, right? 1 in 8 adults in a MAD survey admitted to driving within 2 hours of using. It affects on driving, right? Slows reaction time and impairs coordination and interferes with the ability to make quick decisions. That kind of sounds familiar. Distorts perception of time and distance. Impacts concentration. Lead to poor speed control and inability to read signs. Right? And of course, depending on the product, right? If we're inhaling it, it could last up to 5 hours, maybe more depending on the potency. Consuming edibles, up to 12 hours, right? High potency in any form, at least 10 hours. I mean, so again, we're really focusing on youth here, right? If somebody my age wants to use marijuana, as long as they're getting behind the car, I don't really care, right? It's legal now in Connecticut for people as old as I am, right? But the point is that it's still dangerous for driving. Hey, here's an interesting thing. 2 studies, one from Cleveland, Ohio, one from Colorado, right? They showed that if you're having an elective surgery and used marijuana prior to that, you had experienced 14% more pain during the first 24 hours after surgery, and you consumed 7% more opioids after surgery, right? For those who had a broken leg and were having surgery, right? 50% more anesthetic during surgery. Higher pain scores after surgery, and received 58% more opioids per day while in the hospital. So we're seeing these other different effects related to other drugs. Again, legal drugs, anesthesia, opioids after having my leg broken and being in the hospital for that. This is Connecticut data from accidental overdoses, right? Between 2020 and 21, 33% of all the accidental overdoses also tested positive for marijuana. Obviously, they didn't die from an overdose of marijuana, of course, unless they're behind the wheel on a car. But they also tested for marijuana, which really gets to this polydrug use issue Most drug users are polydrug users. Hospital admission data, right? Admission for a marijuana intoxication rate up for almost 500% for kids under the age of 18, up almost 400% for adults 19 and over, right? Those addicted to marijuana having a mental illness, up 200%. Marijuana users having a mental illness, up 29%. Marijuana abusers diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, up 300%. And in 2018, here in Connecticut, we started seeing children aged 0 to 9, right, starting to show up in hospital emergency rooms with cannabis-related issues. And while the numbers were small, those numbers between 2018 and 2020 tripled. We're seeing this. Oh, and those are marijuana-covered chocolate raisins. Nice, huh? The Connecticut Poison Control Center, right? Calls regarding children ingesting cannabis. And we just found out this week there were 100 to more than 100 in 2020. They were now at 200 last year. Okay, so they went up, they doubled again, right? And we sent this on Friday, so I didn't have time to update this presentation, but they're up to 200 now, right? And these are, again, for children, right? These are not our adult calls. These are children calls, right? And nationwide, between 2018 and 2020, we saw a 6-fold increase involving youth marijuana ingestions. Just a few points from other states, right? Almost a third of Colorado youth who used marijuana reported driving, right, after using. That was in 2020, up from just 9% in 2017. So in those 3 years, it increased not quite, well, more than 300%, right? Colorado teen visits in the emergency department for marijuana increased after legalization, and 71% were for psychiatric events. So when they were going to the emergency department after using marijuana, 71% of those visits were for psychiatric events. And again, this study from CERTA showed that 25% increase in cannabis use disorder among 12 to 17-year-olds in legal states compared to non-legal states. So that is just a really brief overview and summary of the harms of marijuana. I mean, I could talk literally all day on the harms of marijuana. But we have other things to cover in this presentation, like the law, so I'm handing it back to Melissa.
Okay, deep breath, right? So what did we pass in Connecticut? So in 2021, June 22nd, 2021, Governor Lamont signed into law Connecticut's commercial cannabis law, and its official name is an Act Concerning Responsible and Equitable Regulation of Adult Use Cannabis, or RERACA. You'll hear it referred to as RERACA occasionally. The bill is 303 pages long with 173 subsections. This is also where I put the disclaimer in that I am not an attorney. So what is in this presentation is what I've learned from reviewing this law, talking to legislators, and seeing how it's implemented. And we're not going to hit it all because it's 303 pages. So the highlights for families and for people who are focused on prevention is what we're really going to talk about. So what's allowed? As of July 1st, 2021, possession and consumption of marijuana by anyone over the age of 21 is permitted. Adults 21 or older can possess up to 1.5 ounces of marijuana in public and up to 5 ounces in a locked container in their car or in their home. So I've been doing this for many years. I didn't know what 1.5 ounces of marijuana is, but if you look at a typical joint, it would be about 75 joints in an ounce. So obviously we're talking about plant matter. So that means you can walk around with about 115 joints worth of marijuana on your person, and in a box in your car, you can have 375 joints worth of marijuana. Now, obviously, I showed you lots of other products. So they try to make equivalencies. So 1 ounce of plant matter, the law says, is equal to 5 grams of concentrate, which is equal to any other product less than 500 milligrams of THC. Because it's really complicated when you're talking about beverages and edibles and concentrates and plant matter. So it's hard to find these equivalencies. And the law says, okay, in Connecticut, you can possess plant matter, concentrates, extracts, oils, tinctures, shatters, waxes, infused food, and infused beverages. So a whole raft of products, some of which we already showed you, obviously. The law does say use is prohibited any place where smoking cigarettes is prohibited, and it specifically says it's not allowed to be used in state parks or beaches. In terms of the sale of all THC products, including Delta 8, Delta 10, Delta 11, all those other ones I showed you, does require a state cannabis license as of July 1st, 2021. So all those gas stations that are selling any sort of other THC product, all those farmers markets, that is not permitted at this time unless they have a cannabis license from the state. It does require the seller ensure a purchaser age, so similar to alcohol, and it very specifically allows delivery. So although you have a moratorium in Wilton, you have to permit marijuana businesses in other towns to deliver to your residents. You can't prohibit it according to the law. It does, to be fair to our legislators, they did try to put some safeguards in place. So they put caps on THC potency, which we were the first state to do that. They capped THC at 30% for plants and 60% for concentrates. So certainly a step, but as John explained, anything over 10% is high potency, so we now have permitted products. The other thing that concerns many of us who work with youth is that the law specifically excludes pre-filled vape cartridges from potency caps. So those can be sold at 95, 97, 99% THC. And since we know those are the products that appeal to young people or young adults, there's certainly area for concern there for us prevention folk. In terms of edibles, they placed a cap at 5 milligrams of THC per serving. They said that the servings need to be demarked on the product. So think of a Hershey bar and how there's 8 little squares. Our product, so if a cookie is supposed to be 6 servings, it's supposed to be marked with 6 servings. The law also says that edibles need to be sold in a white packaging, kid-proof, which I haven't seen how we kid-proof brownies, but and other cookies or baked goods or lollipops, so I'm curious to see how that looks in implementation. But that is what's in the law. So the product's not supposed to be visible through the packaging. One area of concern for us who work with young people or work with families or people who might be new to marijuana is the law only requires basic age warning. So all they say is that the package has to say not to be used by anyone under 21. No information on the harm to the teenage brain, no information required on not to be used if you're pregnant, nothing about don't use this and operate heavy machinery or drive a car. So really the warnings that we require on cannabis are significantly less detailed than what we already require on alcohol and tobacco. In terms of the sale, DCP, the Department of Consumer Protection, has issued retail licenses, non-medical retail licenses to 9 hybrid retailers. Those are businesses that already had medical marijuana licenses. 7 of them opened 2 weeks ago. I'm sure you saw all the press coverage. Super, more press coverage than I've ever seen on anything. Right now, to ensure there's adequate supply, initial sales were limited to 1/4 ounce of cannabis flower, or its equivalent per transaction. So there's all the equivalencies. You could buy 7 bigger cigarettes, 14 smaller cigarettes, 2 to 4 vape cartridges, how much, depending on how much is in there, and then edibles vary depending on how much was in there. But in combination, you can't go in and buy at one time any more than 1/4 ounce of marijuana. There's nothing to prevent what's called looping, which is like I just go in and buy more in a separate transaction or go to another business. So there's no control that way. In terms of what the consequences are for underage possession, I don't know if you guys can see that. It's pretty small. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about it, but it's sufficient to say that if a young person, if someone under 21 is stopped with marijuana, if they're under 18, the first offense is a verbal warning and an optional referral to the JRB. And the second offense is a JRB referral, a juvenile review board, which is a community panel. The second, for anyone 18 to 20, they have to sign a health statement, and there's a minor fine of $50. These are significantly less serious than the alcohol possession penalties. So the message in the law to our kids is that this is not as big of a deal as alcohol possession. If an underage person gets pulled over and they have alcohol in their car, any alcohol, they get charged with an underage possession. It gets referred to the Department of Motor Vehicles. There's a license consequence to their driver's license. There's none of that in the cannabis law. So even the law to our kids says, hey, we don't think this is as serious as alcohol. There's a social host law. You're probably all aware of the alcohol social host law, where adults are held criminally liable if they allow young people to drink or on their property or any property they control. There is the same penalty in place for cannabis. So those of us who see that as a really big prevention tool, we're pretty happy to see that. School policies, your school people have that under control. Home grow was a big discussion when this law was being considered, and we did allow, our law does allow home grow. It says adults 21 and older can possess up to 3 immature and 3 mature plants effective this coming July 1st. Now, I'm so naive. I think of marijuana plants and I think of like tomato plants, right? I think like small. When you talk marijuana plants now, they talk canopy. These things are like trees. So there's going to be some pretty significant home grow when you can have 6 marijuana trees in your yard or in your property. And medical marijuana clients 18 and older can already grow as of a year and a half ago almost. So any one household can have up to 12 plants. Cannabis and driving, John talked about the risks of cannabis and driving. The law specifically says use is prohibited in vehicles, but it also puts significant restraints on law enforcement on when they can stop someone. Seeing someone smoking marijuana or smelling marijuana is not sufficient to pull someone over under this law. The police must also observe them committing some other traffic or other kind of offense. So that does really kind of limit the police department from preventing. You can't drive with a beer in your hand, but you can drive with a joint in your hand under this law. The law puts a lot of responsibility on what's called advanced roadside impaired driving enforcement and our drug recognition experts. Do you have a DRE in Wilton? You do. You're very lucky. It's a very extensive, it's like a 2-week training course in Arizona. It's very expensive. It's also very hard to recertify. Many towns in Connecticut don't have a DRE, a drug recognition expert, and the legislators were just like, oh, just borrow your neighbors. Now, there's no roadside test for marijuana. You can't blow in a tube and we can tell if you're impaired or not. It's a very complicated assessment process. So the idea that, Wilton's DRE is sitting around waiting in case some other town needs them is fairly unrealistic, especially with so many departments having officer shortages. So there's a lot of communities, we're 169 fiefdoms in Connecticut. There's a lot of communities that don't have these resources and so don't have the skilled officers that can do these kind of assessments. And this is a real area of concern for a lot of us about impaired driving. Advertising. This is my own personal mission. The 2021 law prohibited any advertising that was targeting kids. So they said you can't advertise anywhere unless you can show that 90% of the target audience is over 21. And you can't sponsor events, and you can't do all these things. You can't have advertisements within 500 feet of schools. And that sign there, which I took myself, that picture, that was at the exit 27 on 95, which is the Route 8 95 exchange. Massively busy. That sign was perched above the Webster Arena, next to the Hartford Healthcare Amphitheater, at the exit you take for the University of Bridgeport and Housatonic Community College and the Port Jeff Ferry. It didn't meet any of the law's requirements, and we had them all over the state. If you drove up 91 or 84, it was almost like south of the border. you're 26 miles from Massachusetts and we're open and we're selling. And I mean, it was bananas. But we did some stuff to fix that, which I'll talk about in a second. The law also says you can't show the products from the outside of the store. You can't have any logos that are similar to non-cannabis or illegal products. So hopefully no Pop-Tarts and no Klondike bars. But a lot of this depends on compliance. You need sellers who are complying, and you need compliance checks from your regulators. Where does the money go? Show me the money. We were all told there was going to be all this money, right? And there probably will be a significant amount of money. We've generated money already based on just the lottery and the license fees. And then once we start selling, the revenue comes from the Connecticut sales tax. And then there's an additional tax based on the potency of the product. Anybody read how the buyers are a little upset at how expensive it is? It's expensive stuff now because there's all these fees on there. So where does the money go? Year one, 100% of the money was going to set up the industry, to set up the regulatory body, set up the bureaucracy, get it all working, hire the people to do this stuff. After year two, 100% goes to the general fund. That's the money that funds our state government. After year two, it drops to 0 by year 6, 7. There's a social equity and innovation fund, which is designed to promote the cannabis industry in the communities that were adversely impacted by the war on drugs. That gets the lion's share of the money starting in year 3. Us prevention folk, your Wilton prevention folk, we start getting hopefully some money in year 3, but 25% of the revenue is going to go to the Prevention and Recovery Services Fund, and that's for prevention, treatment, recovery, and data. In our state, those are 4 separate silos. So we don't know how that 25% is going to be divided up. And I don't know about you, but in my book, prevention means before the problem arises. So year 3 is concerning. Who's got the oversight for this? So the DCP is given this enormous task, the Department of Consumer Protection. They have responsibility for all the setting up, all the regulations, all the packaging, the warnings, other rules for sale, and doing compliance checks. They've got the double task of protecting our safety, but ensure there's enough marijuana out there for anyone who wants it. They also are tasked to make sure that there's plenty of marijuana for the medical marijuana market as well. So they have to serve a bunch of masters. And as I mentioned, there's a social equity fund, so there's a social equity council that oversees that. Local control, this is where you guys can act. The law does say towns can act in the interest of the public health of its residents. You can decide where cannabis can be consumed and whether to allow a marijuana business. Thankfully, you're small, but any municipality over 50,000 people has to designate a public place for marijuana consumption, according to the law. So some of the bigger municipalities are grappling with that. And even if you pass a moratorium, which I understand you guys have, 10% of your electors can submit a petition and force a town referendum to make you have marijuana sales under this law. So I don't know that that's happened yet in any community, but it's a possibility. If you do allow marijuana sales in the future, you can charge a 3% additional tax. And you can use it for these things. So there is education programs, mental health or addiction services, or youth services bureaus and juvenile review boards, which we need to deal with the kids who get stopped with marijuana. So what did we do in the next year? Next year, the legislature had to clean up some of the stuff in the first law. So I don't know if any of you read about there was a cannabis bazaar in Hampton where people were like paying an entrance fee, going in, and then being gifted cannabis. So like it was a runaround around the law. They eliminated that. You can't gift it to people you don't know. You can't put it in goodie bags. So they really kind of tried to tamp that down. And also there was no tax revenue on that. The other thing it did is we got rid of those billboards, so that billboard in Bridgeport I showed you is no longer there. We can no longer have any illuminated or elevated billboards between the hours of 6 a.m. and 11 p.m. And you can't have a billboard if you don't have a Connecticut cannabis license. So none of those like Cannabis Nation, go to our website and we'll show you the nearest pot shop. So you do see some restrictions. There's a whole bunch of other restrictions in there. It also expanded. You can't advertise within it was originally 500 feet, it's now 1,500 feet from elementary or secondary schools. We've found a problem with the law because even though you can't advertise within 1,500 feet, the law establishes no limit to where you can put them. So you can put them 500 feet from a school, but you just can't advertise a store. You can't advertise marijuana within 1,500 feet of a school. So we've got some things to work on there. What's going on now? There are 20 bills currently at the legislature, 20 that I counted, there may be more now, that focus on the growth, sale, or regulation of or use of cannabis. Many look to further regulate the market. There's bills looking to put in health warnings, cap vape cartridges, all sorts of stuff. There's others that looking to support the market. So there's some out there too. Some people want to let hemp growers into the market. Some want to give tax breaks to the cannabis businesses because they can't, they can't write off their business expenses on their federal taxes because it's still illegal. So some state legislators want to give them more tax breaks in Connecticut. The cannabis industry itself has their own requests. They want to eliminate all potency caps. They say it makes it hard to compete with Massachusetts, and they want to stop the restrictions on packaging because they want to sell the same products here that they sell in other states. We see they want to protect their business and they're looking for tax breaks. So there's all sorts of things being wrangled in the legislature this session, so you might want to keep your eyes out for that. So what can we do to protect our kids? And John's going to pop up and give you just a few tips. I think just in the interest of time, just some things you can do as a community and as families to protect your children.
Okay, so here's 4 areas that we know work. The research and the studies on prevention really are clear that when kids know that cannabis is harmful, when they know that their parents disapprove, right? When they don't have easy access to it, and when their peers disapprove of use as well, that these are the things that really create that bubble around a kid so that they're much less likely to use. And, one of the things that I always used to hear from parents, fortunately not really recently, was, well, my kid's 16 years old now, and when I was 14, I told them that I was opposed, they shouldn't be using marijuana. Well, adolescent development, right? If my parents haven't said anything for 2 years, well, it must be okay now, right? The absence of no does mean yes, doesn't it, right? I mean, it's that kind of thing. So we have to keep talking. Right? Talk early and talk often. That's actually a national campaign, right? Establish family expectations, right? That it's not acceptable, right? And enforce consequences. Don't set any expectations that you can't enforce, please, right? Help your kids build an exit strategy, right? When they get into a difficult situation, right? How do you help them get out of that? They text you, they call you, they use the keyword or whatever it is, and no questions asked, we go get them, right? And we bring them home and we'll talk about it tomorrow or whatever, right? Monitoring our kids, right? Prevent access to all cannabis in your home. So if somebody has a medical marijuana license, there's an adult using cannabis, lock it up, right? Lock it up. Don't let the kids have access to it, right? Don't put your marijuana gummies in the drawer with the snack so the kid takes that out by accident. This has happened in kindergartners, right? They show up with the marijuana gummies in there or whatever, snacks in there. Anyway, talk with parents, right? Build a network. That's what this is all about, right? Support your local prevention council. And when you talk to your kids, right, take some time to prepare yourself, right? Stay calm. Don't get all, if you're all worked up, that's not the time to have the conversation. Wait a few minutes or an hour or whatever it takes, right? Express your concerns clearly. Don't be judgmental, right? Right? Avoid power struggles, right? This is adolescent development stuff, right? Avoid power struggles with your teenagers at all costs, right? Make sure you listen to your kids. What are they telling you, right? Make sure you keep that door open so that they're telling you what's going on, right? Active listening. Did I hear that right? Let me repeat that back to you, right? Assist them in problem solving as much as they want or need, right? make sure the solution is theirs, and then it's realistic. Yeah, I could really do that. Can you do that? I could do that, right? Ask them for what they need from you, right? And the conversation with clear action steps for both you and for them, right? And I'm just gonna repeat something Melissa said at the very beginning of this presentation. The word recreational, right? It's mostly a positive word, right? We probably all need to recreate more than we really are, right? And so calling it recreational cannabis is this positive normative kind of language, right? It's not that, right? Recreational cannabis is not a word that I really encourage you to use. You know, talk about retail sales, talk about adult use, right? Don't talk about recreational cannabis, please. Okay, you know, I'm not gonna spend time on this. You're gonna get this slide, but if you did allow, especially these growers, gosh, the environmental impact is crazy with some of this stuff. There's all, if you Google the environmental impact of marijuana growing, you're gonna see some incredible pictures. Outreach to legislators, following up on what Melissa was just talking about, the law, right? You know, we need lower THC caps overall, and certainly for those vapes, because this is what our kids are most attracted to, right? And we need those stronger comprehensive health warnings on all products. The new law, or the bill that the Republican leadership just proposed in the House has some good health warnings in it. This is the kind of stuff we need. And we need to align these consequences of youth possession with alcohol. I mean, the fact is, right, you know, the whole thing we're having with car thefts in the state, right? Kids were stealing cars because if I'm, you know, this, you know, I can get these kids to steal the cars for me because they've got a slap on the hand, right? This is what's going to happen with marijuana growing, right? I mean, I can get my kids to sell pot in Wilton, and if they get caught here, I'll send them over to Weston, because you're not going to be communicating with Weston who got caught here and all that kind of stuff, right? And then I'll send them Trumbull or wherever, right? Greenwich, right? I got plenty of options, right? This is what's going to happen if we're not careful, if we don't change the law. Some great resources. Again, you're going to get this PowerPoint presentation, resources for families, and then also some general good resources on finding out more information about marijuana, including this PowerPoint slide. So thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Hit the enter slide one more time. I forgot to do that.
Sorry, on the key.
Button on the computer.
Oh, the enter button on the computer.
Yeah, there's us.
There we go. There we go. Personal information. There you go. Thank you, Melissa and John, for that incredibly informative presentation. Anybody learn anything? Hands up. I'm sure there are going to be questions and comments from the audience. Just a reminder that we're going to record the Q&A. I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel now, so we're going to let them come on up, all my panelists, and then I'll make sure everyone knows who they are. All right, excellent. So I'm going to introduce the panel, and we're going to give them a chance to drink some water because I'm sure Melissa and John need a drink. Okay. So I'm not going to go sequentially in order here, but when I say your name, if you could just lift your hand. First, I'll introduce Anthony Nave. He's the clinical director of Mountainside Treatment Center. He's a licensed clinical social worker who holds master's degrees in educational psychology and clinical social work. He is advanced certified in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is called EMDR, and he's an EMDR consultant. He continues to train and consult with staff across the continuum to utilize EMDR and trauma response clinical interventions. Anthony is also experienced in medication-assisted treatment, co-occurring disorders, and adolescent programming. Prior to joining Mountainside, he taught in an alternative therapeutic school, helping youth with mental health and cognitive disorders. At Mountainside, he oversees clinical programming for the full continuum of care and incorporates interpersonal neurobiology and a trauma response framework into treatment and supervision. At home, Anthony enjoys pretending to be superheroes with his sons and rooting for the Red Sox and the Patriots. Sergeant Frank Rizea. Frank joined the Wilton Police Department in December of 2006. He's the Union Vice President and a Field Training Officer. He has received both the MAD Award and the Life Saving Award. Frank became a school resource officer at Wilton Public Schools in October of 2021 and was recently promoted to sergeant in December 2022. Congratulations, Frank. Frank is also a father of 3. Dr. Robert O'Donnell is the principal of Wilton High School. He has been an administrator at Wilton High School for 19 years. Wow. Previously, that's a long time. He served in teacher and administrator roles in Europe, Connecticut, and Minnesota. As principal, he's fully committed to the health and wellness of Wilton students. Nicole Kersey, Dean of Students at Middlebrook School, has been employed by the Wilton Public Schools since 2012. She began her tenure in Wilton as a special education teacher and instructional leader. She works closely with the red teams, my daughter's in red, special education and STRIDE departments, and emergency operations committee. Prior to joining the Wilton Public Schools, she served as an autism and inclusion specialist for the Darien Public Schools, a special education teacher for cooperative education services, and an early childhood interventionist in California. You all are so lovely. So we're gonna start out having Tony speak for a few minutes about his experience and recommendations from a clinical point of view. And at that point, we will open up for questions. And just a reminder again, we're gonna come around with some mics, so if you wanna raise your hand, we'll make sure someone gets a mic to you, but if you'd prefer to write your questions on the little index cards on your seat, that's fine too. Just kind of wave them in the air, we'll make sure we get them, and we'll make sure they're read. All right. Thank you, Tony.
How's it going? I'm gonna build off the presentation. Some key points that are important for me that came up in that presentation is when we talk about one, it's definitely never one substance. Most of the time it is polysubstance use for most of the clients that come through our doors at Mountainside. The other part of it too is very rarely is it just substance use, it's co-occurring disorders, and I think that word is even deceiving in itself. Co-occurring disorders implies that there's a substance use disorder or like depression or PTSD that's parallel to each other, but the reality is it's more comorbid. They feed each other. So substance use will progress someone's depression or anxiety or PTSD, and the reverse will also progress a substance use disorder. They're not just living in their own space, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Okay, I see nodding heads, so I'll take that as a good thing. And then building off what he was talking about for the adolescent brain. The adolescent brain, so all of our brains are Play-Doh, and that's a good thing. That's for us so we can adapt, evolve based off different experiences, right? The key difference is I'm older, so I'm pretty boring now. The adolescent brain intentionally makes younger kids take risks so they have more experiences. That's a good thing, but it also could have a cost. So if those risks are dangerous, or if those risks are experimenting with drugs or alcohol or being with the wrong crowd, yes, that increases your risk of developing pathways to stay in that neighborhood, right? But if we don't have experiences, we're also not going to develop. So it could also lead to more friends, that gives me more interactions and more experiences develop. The part that we all like to develop, right? That can think about thinking. Community, sense of purpose, all that good stuff. It doesn't happen without experiences. So when we talk about vape pens and weed and all those other things, I'm all about process. So there's cost and benefit to everything. So yes, there's medical marijuana. That's probably a good thing for those cases, right? But when we think of adolescents who have more risk factors, maybe they're they're not as connected. They're not doing well with peers. They had anxiety or depression, or they had trauma from their past. That creates more risk factors to use substances to feel safe, to regulate emotions, to calm themselves down that we're not getting from our environment, right? So that's how that goes back to feeding each other. It's never usually one without the other. It's usually both. And we'll see that at Mountainside coming through our doors. And I think the other big thing from this presentation too is synthetics. We see a lot of synthetics. If you're just dropping things in oil, it's not hard. And I know we're gonna regulate and have some type of process to monitor what's going on with THC, but that's also expensive. And there's still gonna be a cheap, unregulated option out there. It doesn't go away. So you're gonna be able to put whatever you want in there still without anyone really knowing. And when we come, a lot of clients coming through Mountainside that are struggling with substance, like with THC in particular, usually we're seeing a lot of acuity with the mental health. We're seeing psychosis, we're seeing hallucinations, we're seeing paranoia increase, we're seeing depression through the scales, anxiety, all these things are spiked up, right? Because THC can do that. It feeds those other symptoms, right? Going back to the idea of comorbid disorders as opposed to co-occurring. They're not happening separately. They're happening together and making each other stronger. So it takes us a while. So maybe by the time someone goes through 35 days in residential, and this is on top of an extra 5 to 7 days in detox, now we're starting to see the paranoia or the hallucinations and things start to peel away, and we can start working on everything else is there, or it doesn't, right? And he was talking about schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, because again, our brains are Play-Doh, can stay dormant. It is passed down genetically, but if you have enough protective factors, it can stay dormant. But if you're smoking THC or other things or other risk factors, it can awaken that genetic potential, right? So maybe it doesn't dissipate after 35 days or 2 months or 3 months. And now we have this other comorbid disorder on top of a substance use disorder, on top of depression. So it's just, they feed each other. I think that's the biggest takeaway, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are we just going down the line?
It's Q&A
Oh,
now.
Q&A?
Can you hear me?
Really?
Oh, thank you, Tony, for that. So we will look for hands. We will look for cards. I do have a few questions that have come in. So if nobody wants to raise a hand, I'll get started. Oh, we have a hand here. Okay.
All right. So as a follow-on to what you were just saying, you know, in sort of the recovery process, a little closer. Okay, sorry. In the recovery process. So what is the horizon of recovery? Imagine a 16-year-old who is now in treatment at Mountainside. So how are we getting this child back into school and with comorbidities? Let's say we have a comorbidity of ADHD with OCD, and you know, this is not uncommon. And now we've introduced THC, and now we're going to go back into the community. What are we looking at a recovery horizon? I'm not thinking it's 2 months. I'm thinking it's 6 months to a year or 2 years. And if we've developed some sort of psychosis, what are we looking at? Are we looking at college as part of this recovery horizon? And the reason I ask this is because I think we need to really be looking at the long-term recovery process for a child who's seriously affected by THC with comorbidities.
So recovery, when we talk about recovery in general, we're always looking to maintain long-term recovery. Recovery doesn't mean 35 days and you're good. With any client at Mountainside, adults or adolescents, our goal is to get clients to a year, and that doesn't necessarily mean people are done after a year. What that means from all the longitudinal studies through SAMHSA, what we found is after a year, you get 75% recovery back of all prior baseline before substance use. You get 75% of that back. Your prognosis is 75%. You're going to repeat another year. What the study found over time is that it actually takes 6 years to get back to baseline before you started actively using. It's dependent based on history, right? So thinking about that, your first year, you could be in intensive, you could be in detox residential for the first month and a half, maybe 2. Then you have intensive outpatient, which is therapy from anywhere from 15 to 9 hours a week for another month and a half. And then we encourage you to step down to outpatient level of care. A baseline plan at Mountainside looks like a recovery maintenance group and an individual once a week. That's still about 2.5 hours of recovery, right? And then you add other potential groups that fit your story or your needs, right? And that can go on up to a year, but that doesn't mean stop. That means you step down maybe to a private practice and you keep going once a week or bi-weekly over time, right? So it's the longer you keep someone engaged in treatment or community supports and everything in between to get to the 6-year mark to get back to baseline. And the comorbid disorders just make that process complicated and maybe even a little bit longer. So it's hard to tell for each story. And the other caveat that I'll throw in there is meth is in a world of itself, and it looks like it creates permanent damage, but again, that's relative. Neuroplasticity will repair over time. We just don't live long enough as people for that repair to actually happen. So that's the other caveat with meth that you'll start seeing probably a little bit more in this area as it comes through New York City. Okay.
Thank you. One of the questions we had was, has there been an increased cannabis products showing up in the high school and or middle school? And what is the school official policy? Thank you.
I'll share some data because, data speak. So this year so far, we have 2 incidents of THC vaping. And I just took 2 years of longitude of that. And then last year we had 2 drug paraphernalia, 4 vaping, and another vaping THC. So the policy is, we want to have obviously drug-free schools. So if students are caught, what we do, and by the way, the drug of choice it's the vaping, it's the THC vaping, the dab pens that we talked about. If a student is caught, we try to have an educational piece, and then there is certainly a punitive piece. So the punitive piece it's an 8-day suspension, and if the family and the student agree to do an educational program, it's automatically reduced to 5. I've never had a family or a student not take that option. So it's essentially 5 days. Now Connecticut has an understanding now, it's relatively new, that there's an assumption that suspensions are in school unless there's an imminent health or safety risk to the student or other students of the school community. So that's been a shift in recent years. So the student would be suspended 5 days, at which time you want to start an educational program. Full transparency, it's been difficult for us to find a really good drug counselor, if you will. We do have somebody now that we're able to recently hire, and we're training that person, and we're looking to do some cross-training. So for the past few years, it was a question of saying, okay, let's get this person in touch with the school nurse and or the school counselor. Many of us would call them the guidance counselor. But to be clear, they're not really trained in that area. So I think that's been a blind spot for us. So we're working to get this new person trained well. So really, that's what it is. It's a 2-pronged approach, and that's generally how it goes. Second offenses are obviously more severe. It's also a 14-day participation rule violation. So if the student were involved in either athletics and or co-curriculars, it's a 14-day suspension from that. That really just kind of sums up the policy and how we approach it. Anything with transmission or dealing or everything is a mandatory expulsion.
And if I can just say something to add, whether those numbers seem high or low, I guess is opinion. Yeah, I would say, and the reason for that is dealing with a lot of the meetings with the admin. I mean, it's definitely a priority with Dr. O'Donnell and at Middlebrook. So he's been pretty progressive as far as the bathrooms, making sure that we're monitoring the kids to check how they're acting. If they're acting a little weird, we try to have conversations with them. So, I mean, it's definitely something in the schools that it's a big priority. Just even me being at the high school, checking the bathroom, seeing what the kids are doing, seeing where they're going. So I think they're on alert that we're watching, which I think in the school has definitely helped.
we've really ramped that up to Officer Rosea's point. So last year, many of you heard about the TikTok challenge. There were students, trying to destroy different parts of, certainly schools and high schools and colleges. And we had a real problem. I mean, kids are interesting. It was just this phenomenon where, understated, but yeah. We had, it was like a cultural thing where, particularly the boys, but also the girls, they were just literally hanging out in bathrooms. And that's where they wanted to be. Whether they're free or not. So they're hanging out in bathrooms, eating in bathrooms, drinking. It was really, so last year, it was a real problem that we had, these kids hanging out in bathrooms. We saw, many more vape cartridges, if you will, ending up on floors or in toilets. And it was a real problem. So, this year and even part of last year, we just really ramped it up. And, you want, administrators and the rest of us be instructional leaders, but we've just prioritized having regular tours, if you will, going around and just monitoring both boys and girls' bathrooms. We're not seeing the traffic in there at all this year. I think we've routed them out. We don't have our heads in the sand, believe me. I mean, we realize, I think these incidence rates, let's face it, these kids are clever. We heard our colleagues here talk about how discreet these things can be. They're small. If you go into a bathroom, to be able to discern whether it's vaping, which also is prohibited, obviously, but it's treated differently than THC. But it's very hard to discern, what is there. And then we turn it over to Frank, and Frank now can test it. But that piece has improved. But, clearly, we saw the slides that you showed, and it is a big issue. So we're trying to eradicate it from the high schools, both also through an educational standpoint, through health class, et cetera. Nicole, I'm going to let you off. Go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. I think at the middle school, I spend a lot of time in the bathroom, not gonna lie. I walk in, I interrupt TikTok dances. I break up hot chip eating challenges yesterday. 5 kids went to the nurse. I mean, there's a lot of ridiculousness that happens in middle school. It's amazing what you can see throughout a day, but I think what we're concentrating on the most is our prevention and our education, through our health classes, through our life classes with our counselors, and then also, just diligent in our, oversight in the bathrooms, walking in, and then making sure that we're promoting, honesty and standing up if you hear something, if you see something. We have an Upstanders Club, which is just for that, and we're trying to promote that kind of behavior so that we can help those who need it. And then if we do find it, which has been rare, and I'm sure our numbers are very low also, it's really a learning experience, what can happen when we get to the big scary high school, but also involving our SROs to make sure that they know it's a serious thing, and then educating. And Kim Zemo and I are working on some educational practices for maybe after something like this happens, so that if you have an occurrence that you can, maybe have some special lessons or some special follow-up through the schools also, not just through outside counseling.
How are you addressing things like, I've heard stories in schools of the gummies, chocolate bars, exactly like, how are you figuring out which ones are actually gummies and which ones are not?
Can you repeat the question
not-
on
I
that?
have not
Sorry,
seen
I didn't get the mic to you.
Yeah, as far as that, I haven't had to test anything like that at this point, so it seems like the vape has been pretty much standard. The vapes, I think, are just easier to get right now. So as more stores open, as more really parents start to try this stuff and get it in the household, I think probably we'll see some more of that, because they'll have access to it. Right now, they just don't, unless they're getting it from a sibling or somebody older who has a license, or they can go to Massachusetts and get it. I'm sure we will see it, but I haven't at this point.
We haven't had specific instances. We've had instances where, we hear the kids are down eating pop brownies. So you go down and you address it with the kids, and you screen them and check them and try to discern. But that hasn't happened in a little while now. We haven't seen the gummies yet.
Hi there. Thank you, first of all of you, for all that you're doing. It's very helpful and reassuring to know that there are individuals like you all out there trying to help. I'm a mom of a 13 and 15-year-old boys, and I find this all terrifying, really, to deal with. I have tons of questions, but I'll narrow it to two. One is legislative and one is legal. The legislative is, could you possibly post either a note or something that could give us a little guidance or a little bit of information that we could actually pick up and just automatically send off to our state legislatures to do it? I know personally, if the note was somewhat written and I just had to say, "Dear Senator Himes," and then put my name, I'd constantly be sending it, and I think that would be a big help. The second is, I'm visiting from another town, and I'm going to go to them and say they need to do this. But more importantly, my 15-year-old this past summer went to a party. I called the mom. I said, "I'm that obnoxious mom. I'd like to know that you're going to be home. There won't be booze," all of that. My son was going to kill me, but I was like, if you want to go to the party, that's the only way you go. We have a very open relationship with him, and we dropped him off at 8, and at 10 o'clock he called and said, "Mom, some girls are afraid I'm going to leave the party and take them to ice cream or something." In the way driving them to the party, I got a picture of the mother loading up the pool party with beers and alcohol and all of that. But more disturbing, and I'm looking at my friendly police officer, is when my son got in the car after we dropped everyone off, he said, "Mom, there were kids vaping," which I'm used to, but it smelled different. So automatically I'm like, okay, there was pot. And then he said, "But they kept passing around something called Molly." Right, he's 15. I'm like, I almost drove off the road and thought, now I'm gonna get arrested, but that's another thing. I remembered when I picked him up, I saw what I believed were older siblings who were vaping in a car. And the thoughts in my head were, do I call the cops? And then my son will never talk to me again, but do I call the cops? And then I hear that there's really no repercussion, it sounds like.
There would be repercussions for the parents allowing children to use drugs and alcohol on their property, and it's pretty serious. The social host law, the penalty is $2,000. It could be up to $2,000 per kid.
Okay, there were 80 kids at the party.
So there's some serious and the public shaming of potentially ending up in the newspaper. But the police have to know to respond. And some towns have tip lines and things, or you can call the non-emergency line at your whatever town you live in, police department. But there are some pretty stiff penalties for the adults.
And then can I ask, what do? You just call the local police department and say, "I'd like to report"? I mean, do you go into a full description?
Yeah, so on top of that, we did have about 3 situations this past year where parents were issued summonses to go to court because they were allowing drinking. So what we would do is, if you called up and said you think that there's underage drinking, is that me? If there was underage drinking going on, we would show up. So we would get usually calls from a neighbor because it's loud and kids are running through the yard. We would get somebody like you who picked up their kid and it's obvious that there's stuff going on. We have gotten calls from other kids. That's obviously rare. So you would call up and say, "I think there's underage drinking," or "You think that there's drugs going on, there's a parking issue," whatever it would be. We would go check it out. We would go to the house and make sure everybody's okay. Generally, in those situations, we either see alcohol or we don't. The vaping thing is tough, of course, because when we show up, they put it in their pocket. We can't question kids, so it really becomes about what we see when we get there. Usually, it's just alcohol everywhere and kids scatter. So that's when we'd go after the parents, and then we try to find these kids in the woods. But the vaping.
I was going to say, what do you tell your children to do if they happen to be, like, I like to believe my son, if he's having these conversations with me, it's not taking part in it. But then what do you tell your son to do when he's standing in the house and the police show up?
Yeah, to stay there.
Stay there.
Yeah, because if they start running in the woods, we see them the next day at school with cuts and bruises all over them. We then have to go find them because we obviously don't want possibly intoxicated kid running through the woods. We want to try to find their parents. So, stay there. Yeah. There's no reason to run. We're not going to be putting kids in handcuffs and bringing them in. We just want to make sure everybody's okay. At that point, we would then go after whose house it is and the parents, and if there's, kids that are of age who are giving this stuff to the kids, and we would look into that too.
And I know this isn't about counterfeit medications, but the discussion about mollies and pills and things, we need to be talking to our kids about never taking a pill that you didn't get from your adult out of the little yellow bottle from the pharmacy, because right now the DEA is saying that 65% of the counterfeit medications that are out there, and they look like the real thing, are laced with potentially deadly doses of fentanyl. And we've had families in the region who have lost their young people because they thought they were taking a Xanax, or they thought they were taking a Molly, or they thought they were taking something else, and it wasn't. So that's just another layer of conversation to be having with our children. And you mentioned meth. We hear that some of the Molly's laced with meth, and you don't know what you're getting, ever. Even with the weed, even with the THC. We talk about kids who are passing around vapes, and I'm like, did you know what was in it? And they'll say, well, no. And I'm like, do you know how you're gonna react to it? And they're like, well, the other guy was okay. And I'm like, not the same thing. You just can't.
Just to add that too, like she was saying, THC is not immune to fentanyl. Fentanyl's cheap to make, and if you're vaping it with oils, it's easy to mix in, right? So, or even could be liquid form, right, and put into things, but also could be a powder. And so it could be sprinkled into whatever you're smoking.
And to
it's
your
not
point,
immune.
the black market has not been eliminated in any state that's legalized. In fact, the black market thrives because it's cheaper than the legal stuff. And a lot of times it may not be intentional, it's just cross-contamination, because the same place where they're packaging up your black market weed, they're packaging up a whole lot of other stuff. So even the people who are manufacturing it don't know necessarily what might be in what they're selling.
And we're saying manufactured, but it could be like someone's garage or basement.
We're talking like
Not a-
rat poop and bleach and,
They've got drug cartels
is a fancy word.
opening up stores in Colorado and realizing that the people who were running this store were part of the Mexican drug cartels. So, and back to your legal question, just so that people are aware, most homeowners insurances have a rider that if somebody gets hurt during one of these alcohol or drug parties, right, they're not going to cover, your homeowner's insurance does not cover any of that stuff, right? Does not cover any of that stuff. So you're on
It's risky to host.
You're on your own. Yep.
Okay, we have a question here.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much. My name is Jacqueline Stevens. My husband and I, we have 3 children, one who is now 15, a 13-year-old who is taller than I am at 5'9", and on the other end of the spectrum, a 9-year-old. And so my question is for Tony. Tony, you mentioned that the addiction and the sort of the mental health, they're comorbidity. I didn't probably pronounce that correctly, but
You did.
they happen at the same time. That said, could you talk about the importance of connection and prevention very early on in life, and how that can be more of effective with preventing even our children, our teenagers, from getting started down that path? Thank you.
Full disclosure, Jacqueline does work for Mountainside, so she definitely should know. No, but at Mountainside, we talk about this as a therapeutic perspective, right? I talk about IPMB, which is mind-body relationships, and it's very much based on human relations has the most charge, sparks the most neurons for the most development. But even at Mountainside, we take the view of addiction as an attachment disorder. We're programmed to make connections, right? Ages 0 to 5. The part of the brain that takes the most damage during addiction is this front part of that prefrontal cortex. We don't really have that from ages 0 to 5. So how do you survive? Through your healthy attachments, your relationships. And then the other part of it to develop your prefrontal cortex is body movement, language, reaching, learning about your body sensations and everything in between, and then learning how to regulate all those emotions. We actually learn 90% of what we're going to learn in life ages 0 to 5. Like the extra 10% is probably more expensive when you think about it, but communication, movement, language, attunement, resonating with people, that's all happening way before we can think about thinking or think about regulating thoughts, right? So, and then back to the thought of adolescents are programmed to take more risks, to develop more relationships outside of that original system, right? But if your original system had struggles or stress, or if there's trauma or everything in between, it increases the risk for using substances to regulate emotions, because you couldn't get a person to help regulate your emotions, right? You couldn't get skills with figuring out your body to soothe yourself, like breath work or things like walking, meditating, all that kind of fun stuff, right? If you struggle with ADHD or depression, or if you have children on the spectrum, that makes it harder to connect, right? So that already puts you at a disadvantage for your full genetic potential. Those are increased risk factors for reaching out to another thing to connect to. And that could be a substance or a behavior. And I often talk about process with addiction because, yes, different substances have chemical hooks that make you addictive, but sex and gambling and internet use don't have a chemical component to it. It's an internal chemical component, right? So lack of connections or healthy attachments or protective factors increase your risk to find connections to other things. So substances and behaviors is a relationship. And I'll talk about this a lot with clients too. You're gonna connect with a substance or a behavior. It's gonna be awesome and fun and, excuse my language, sexy, lusty, everything in between. It feels good, right? But then it starts to isolate you from the other remaining connections that you actually had, right? Then after it isolates you, it starts to beat you up physically, emotionally, right? It's an abusive relationship to be with a substance or a behavior that's addictive. And the less healthy attachments growing up increases your risk to get involved with other relationships that are risky, including relationships with drugs or behaviors. Is that helpful? Not helpful? Thank you.
Super helpful, since I have the mic. This is a question for Wilton. And going back to the fentanyl and opioids and other drug use, what has been the barrier? To my understanding, nurses at the high school still don't carry Narcan. And I'm curious what the barriers to that. Seems like that would be a good idea.
Vanessa, it's interesting you say that. So two things. We did have Narcan. We had a conversation today among the administrative team, and we are going to get Narcan. Yeah.
Yes. Awesome.
Just this morning we were talking about that, and
that's great news.
And the superintendent's in support of it, and the nurses are eager to have it. We want to get the nurses certainly retrained, get us trained, and that's going to happen. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this. It's very helpful. My big question is, if the kids are using the vape cartridges without the telltale odor, what's the best way for us to tell if they're using?
You start.
I know.
Then I'll weigh in.
It's going to be how they present, right? We're going to see different behaviors. You're going to see different moods. You're going to see different ways they interact. You're going to see slower reactions. You're going to see, their eyes are going to be watery and red and different. So it's if you know your kids fairly well, you're going to see the subtle behavior changes. You're going to see the way they look. Then you'll start seeing behaviors and interactions at school. Are they with the same kids or are they with new kids? Were they doing well in school before and now they're drifting off, right? Were they showing up on time to things and now they're not? Were they sleeping in a regular pattern and now it's an irregular pattern? And I know we're talking about adolescents who can sleep all day, right? But it's going to be paying attention to those subtle drifts and behaviors.
Yeah, I would concur with that. So when it's brought to our attention, it can happen any number of ways. I mean, ideally, you catch them red-handed and you determine it and you get them some help. But what happens in our world sometimes is just teachers recognize something. This student seems odd, this student seems off, or they see some of the physical signs and they'll refer them down, and they have to be different approaches to do that. And then what we do first thing is, we'll want to make sure hopefully the student is going to be okay. So we'll get the nurse involved and just have the nurse do a screening, and then those data points and observations are shared with us, and that'll feed into whether we can determine whether the student was, definitely using, and or ultimately there's different regulations on searches and seizures in schools. you know, we have had students who have been vaping, and we've had to send them to the hospital. You know, we've had instances where we determine this kid is just, it's critical, and it's happened in a couple cases where I've been just deeply worried about the student, and we talk to the nurses and just say, we've got to get 911 here. And interestingly, something you brought up, you know, we've had situations where it seems to me with these cases as if one student may have taken, you know, one more or two more rips than one other kid, and depending on the student and their physical constitution and probably many things, whether they've eaten, you know, we've seen some students be relatively okay and other kids, you know, relatively critical. Yeah. So, but I think that's how it presents, speaking for the teachers, knowing your students, knowing their normal behaviors, right, for adolescents, and then recognizing what might be aberrant and being willing to have the courage to say, this doesn't look right, and I'm referring the student or I'm reporting it to the office.
I think as a parent as well, there's some other things you can do. There's equipment with this stuff, right? So there's small glass capsules. You look in their car, look in their rooms, see what their money, like, are they spending money in a way that you're not, you know, that doesn't seem right? You know, are they all Venmoing the same person? Because one kid doesn't provide that much pizza. Seriously, you know, like you can be vigilant as a parent as well, and changes in behavior, changes of friendships. They suddenly want to sleep over at the same house every Saturday night. Something's going on at that house that you don't allow. You know, I think there are some other things that you can kind of keep an eye on for, you know, your kids' behavior. I've clearly been here, clearly done this. But yeah, it's a lot of different, because typically, you know, we've seen in other districts, kids use these products and they have pretty significant psychiatric symptoms. We've had kids with major panic attacks. We've had kids who've gone completely paranoia, had like psychotic breaks. One girl was trying to call her priest because she thought she needed an exorcism in school. You know, not here in Wilton, but, you know, you can have some pretty serious effects, and I'm sure Tony could
The
tell
other
many
thing that I
stories.
might add to that is that, I mean, it's really obvious when those changes happen very suddenly, but sometimes they happen very gradually. I mean, it depends on the kid, right? But so it's really important to pay attention to the gradual changes as well. And it's like, the first day it's like, oh, you know, or the first week it's like, is that a change or not? You know, but remember what it was like in the beginning, and keep that in your mind, because if the change is gradual, you really got to pay attention to that, because all of a sudden it can, you know, it's like, wow, wait, how did we get here? It's like, yeah, got to watch out for those gradual signs.
Sure.
You can see the risk factors too before we even get there, right? If kids are struggling to make friends, if they're isolating, they're not participating as much, it's all those early signs of lack of connection that we were talking about before that might lead to experimenting. I can hang out with these guys and smoke with them, then I have people to be with, right?
And when the co-occurring, what we saw during COVID is a lot of kids, the marijuana use went from being a social activity to being a solo activity, because it was feeding off of the mental health, the isolation, the depression, the anxiety.
And yes, self-medicating with THC for anxiety or depression may help in the moment, but it actually increases, and again, going back to comorbid, feeding each other, progresses someone's generalized anxiety or past trauma or depression. So then you become more reliant on using the external way to soothe. And then you have created two beasts, the original anxiety, depression, and trauma that was there, and now you have a substance use disorder with it.
And some people report anxiety, like severe anxiety and depression, as part of their withdrawal symptoms. So they stop using, and within the first 7 or 8 days, they feel pretty extreme anxiety and depression. So guess what? They reuse, and they're like, wow, that treats my anxiety and depression. But it's because they've just reused a substance that they were withdrawing from. So it's that complicated piece, which I think you've done a wonderful job of explaining.
Thanks.
And Tony, can I just add from your comments before, so if our children have ADD or are on the autism spectrum, what we need to be a little extra aware, would you say, or how do you feel about that?
I think those are increased risk factors to connect to others, right? If you're struggling with ADHD or ADD, right, and someone else is not used to that as far as a peer, it's going to be harder to connect, right? You struggle with depression, another peer is not used to that, harder to connect. on the spectrum, obviously harder to connect, right? So it's going to be trying to, yes, be diligent and monitor, stay in touch with the school team, right? Because they can see your kids just as much what's going on during the day, but also trying to create experiences for your kids to connect to something or someone, right? So just start with activities with other people and other kids, not other people, with other kids and see if they connect, right? And just keep monitoring and keep trying different things. Don't get, it's hard. Don't get frustrated, but just keep trying different experiences, right? Going back to that idea, we need experiences to develop. So try and manufacture them.
And I would just add from the middle school lens that I said this today to a parent, that middle schoolers are like little amoebas, and they go from friend group to friend group, and they go from sports team to sports team. If they start withdrawing or changing friends and you're a little concerned, the best thing you can do is reach out to us and reach out to the teachers, reach out to the counselors, because we see them in usually a very different light than you do. If they're retreating at home, they may be flourishing at school. So I think the biggest thing that we would ask is that you just keep communicating with us and talking to us and getting our impressions, because we'll reach out to you if we're concerned, but we want to know if you're seeing something different at home first too. And then sometimes other kids will report and just say, I'm really concerned about Johnny, and we have a anonymous report email and way to do that. And we've reached out to kids that weren't on our radar because of that, because friends get concerned too.
Thank you. Will legal pot be more expensive than illegal? And by how much do you project? What do you think that'll look like?
It's hard to say because every product costs different, depending on what you're buying. The report is that the legal market suffers at the hands of the illegal market in every other state. I think California had to pump a giant injection of cash into their legal market because it just couldn't compete. I think they gave it like $100 million or something to make it compete with the black market. So, the black market, the price is fluid, right? So they can always undercut the legal market significantly. The other challenge is once we have legal marijuana in retail marijuana in New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, is that you're going to almost be competing on price with those states as well.
Think about it. If I'm a drug cartel lord or something like that, and you legalize marijuana, am I going to let you cut out my business? No. I'm going to figure out a way to keep making my money.
And they don't have the tax.
I don't have to worry about taxes, right?
Regulatory fees, license
all that
fees.
stuff. Yes. So, like Melissa said, I'll cut my price so that I undercut, and people will still come into, that's the way it goes. Yeah. And this is what has been proven in all the states. The black market. In fact, we had the Colorado Attorney General say a few years ago that the black market is flourishing, thriving and flourishing in Colorado. Yeah.
We have another question here. I guess this might be for Sergeant Frank. Does Wilton have a JRB, so a Juvenile Review Board?
No. So we've been in talks with Norwalk, New Canaan, some of the others to kind of join theirs. So right now what we would do is if something like this came in, we obviously have to give the written warning, and then we kind of have our own little diversion program. So whether that be community service, whether that be writing essays, but currently we're not involved with them. We kind of have our own situation because every time we've tried to join like Norwalk and some of the other towns, we just don't have, lack of a better word, the business to kind of insert ourselves into it. So it's definitely something we've looked into even as of recent. It just seems that locally we're able to handle it a little bit better.
Thank you.
It sounds a lot like a JRB, just not calling it JRB, to be honest with you.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're not alone.
I'm the JRB.
You're the JRB. There are quite a number of towns in Connecticut that don't have a JRB or a YSB, which is a Youth Service Bureau. So these towns don't have any real mechanism. So they're probably going to have to develop some sort of informal process like you have done.
Thank you. I have another one that was submitted. What study showed baseline recovery after 6 years?
So I can give you the source because there's 50 different articles, but the lead research on that was Dr. John Kelly, the head of SAMHSA. So if you look up Dr. John Kelly, you're going to see his studies, and it was a longitudinal study over 15 years. So they researched people from start to finish, and this is actually the study that led to some of the data about community sports or 12 steps being productive. if that makes sense too. So everyone's saying that community supports and 12 steps do help. It came from this longitudinal study as well. Sorry, I will get the name of the actual study. But I actually saw Dr. John Kelly twice when he reviewed this research. So.
Do we have any last questions? It's 8:50, so we're almost at the end of the evening. Oh, I see a hand. Okay. I'll come up. Got the mic this time.
So I feel like this is going to be a big challenge for the police department, considering that, kids aren't only going to get a slap on the wrist. They're going to say, we're only going to get a slap on the wrist. I mean, is there anything that we could do? Is there certain measures that you're taking?
Yeah, so to be proactive with this, to be honest, it's very difficult. As they stated, like our hands are tied on a lot of things. Our numbers have come down with marijuana stuff only because prior to the law changing, if we were driving down the road or somewhere we smelt it, we could stop a car, we could search the car and find a lot of this stuff. Now with the new laws, we can't do any of that. So really, it has to be like a DUI situation as far as if we're on the road. And even then, the tests are not current enough. The DREs, the drug experts, can only be brought in after an arrest is made. They can't be used for probable cause to arrest somebody. They can deny being evaluated by this person. So the proactive part is really, that's where the schools, mostly for me, are helping, because they're noticing a lot of behaviors, they're finding stuff in the bathrooms, they're doing a lot of the preventive stuff like this. Outside of that, it's hard. And especially with kids, just the laws, which are good as far as interviewing and speaking to underage kids. So even to question them, even if we saw them in the center, for example, even just to go up to them and ask them, are they smoking marijuana? We can't do that without a parent present, without signatures being signed on forms, which as a parent I agree with. It just definitely adds another layer of difficulty to do it. And on top of it, the parents, even when these kids are caught, oh, it wasn't my kids, he was just holding it. So, I mean, that's a whole nother aspect to deal with also as a parents, which, again, I can understand. It just makes it more difficult.
This is a perfect time to be talking to your legislators about this. And the bill that's being proposed does help with some of those issues. I haven't looked at it closely enough to know that it handles all of it, but this is a perfect time to be talking to your legislators about, okay, we've tied enforcement's hands, and it's time to untie them again.
Yeah, your state reps, your state senators, you should be talking to them about some of your concerns. I mean, there's quite a number of people who are making a connection between the number of wrong-way crashes in Connecticut and the fact that we have had more wrong-way crashes in the last year and a half than we had in the previous 6 years. And so there's either that's a huge coincidence, or we're seeing more impaired driving on the roads. The other thing we didn't cover in the presentation is when you mix alcohol and marijuana, they amplify the effects of both. Yeah. So you feel drunker, and it may take longer for you to realize how high you are.
But also greater danger of overdose with THC and alcohol.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? All right, I want to thank all of our panelists, but before we can... I did want to give each of the panelists an opportunity. If there's anything in closing that you had hoped to be able to push out tonight and weren't able to share, anything you're thinking of now that you would like to share, please do so.
I'm sorry to be that guy, but one thought on vapes. Part of adolescent development is to get into fads, right? The thing with vapes is that you can personalize them. So you can explore your identity, explore your likes, explore your wants with the modifications, how much you take in, how much you don't, the flavors, right? So it's very much you're in control of it and very much yours. So that's why you see vapes probably more common amongst adolescents as a like, right? So thinking of signs earlier for if it's doesn't smell and you can't tell, right? Just look at the progression of how invested someone's getting into their vapes. Like how many parts are they buying for their mods? How many different colors are they buying for their vapes? How many different flavors? Because if your progression of exploring with your vape is getting there, you're probably going to get to a point of exploring with THC.
I would add, we partner with so many Wilton families on so many various issues, and this being one of them. So, and we recognize how difficult it can be for parents and families. So if there's something you're concerned about, reach out to us, administration, a school counselor. We've got some really good people who deal with these various issues. As I said, we really want to get some other people trained up to be ideally DREs, but certainly counselors who can work kids through these issues and support families and refer. Kim Zemo is here. She's an outstanding resource as the Safe School Climate Coordinator for the district on so many of these different things. So if you have concerns, we all have some level of, drug training through our careers as well. We might be able to guide you in the right direction, but it's complex, and don't hesitate to reach out to the schools because we want to help and we want to partner with you.
I echo that. Just please keep talking to us so we can help keep the communication open as much as possible. And thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you to our presenters and panelists, and thank you all for attending. You all had great questions, by the way. Thank you for those. Please complete your evaluations, and you can leave them on the table in the back. And if you enjoyed our program, be aware that we're a 501c3, and we rely on donations to stay alive and to provide programming like this. So there's a code at the back if you'd like to donate. You can also go to our website and donate. We would love to have that. And we also warmly welcome any volunteers who are interested in family and youth well-being. So please feel free to talk to me, Chandra at the back, Heather, maybe even Susan, who's standing there. But we would love to have volunteers, and we're really actively seeking interested folks. So contact us. Have a great night. Thank you so much. And I can't thank you enough. It was wonderful. Thank you.